Hello and welcome to the IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. South Africa has been involved in nuclear development for more than 75 years. The National Nuclear Development Agency was initiated in 1948, only 2 years after the American Atomic Energy Commission. South Africa's first nuclear reactor started operating in 1965, and the country's first large nuclear power station, Koeberg, started operating in 1984. In February 2010, the South African government announced it had stopped funding the Pebble Bed Modular Reactor program. Over $1.3 billion had been invested in the project. However, a group of nuclear engineers and scientists established an independent nuclear development company to continue advancing the technology. They focus on developing the HTMR-100, which is an advanced generation 4 gas-cooled reactor originated in the previous research of that Pebble Bed Modular Reactor. This initiative led to the creation of Stratek Global in 2022. And it's an honor to speak with its leader and chairman, Dr. Kelvin Kemm. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, Martin.
Dr. Kelvin Kemm is a nuclear physicist and chairman of the Stratek Global in Pretoria, South Africa. He is also the former chairman of the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation and has been involved in development of the South Africa Small Modular Reactor program since its inception more than 2 decades ago. Dr. Kemm has spoken at the major international forums and has delivered Senate and congressional briefings in Washington, D.C. He is also a frequent international speaker on nuclear energy, technology, and strategic development. He addresses in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the United States. The most importantly, he has over 25 years of practical experience developing a small modular reactor and basically the nuclear technology in South Africa. So let's start with the first question. And I know this question might seem as impossible to answer in such a short time, but let's speak a little bit. How would you characterize South Africa's nuclear energy policy trajectory since the end of apartheid? And I'm particularly interested in Eskom because it's often said that Eskom is in crisis. But what kind of crisis is it? And what are the main causes of that?
Okay, well, it's interesting to note that South Africa is one of the oldest nuclear countries in the world. In fact, the third oldest nuclear country in the world. And South Africa was passing nuclear legislation way back in the beginning of the 1950s. NECSA, of which I was the previous chairman, the South African Nuclear Authority, was actually founded in 1948. The United States Atomic Energy Commission was 1946, then the British, then us. So we've been in the game a long time. And part of that was way back in the 1940s. The then Prime Minister of South Africa, General Jan Smuts, was a personal advisor to both Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt of the United States. And he was actually informed of the Manhattan Project, the nuclear bomb project for development of weapons that were finally dropped on Japan. He was informed in 1944, which was a year before the weapon was dropped. He was the only other foreign country other than Britain and the US that was aware of it. One of the reasons was at the time the US came along and said, could we have this stuff that you fellows have got? It's called uranium. We were busy throwing the uranium away because it was coming out of the gold mines. South Africa, of course, was the major gold producer of the world. And it was being piled on the waste dumps of the gold mines. There was another place in West Africa as well, what was the previous Congo, which at that point was now under the control of Germany, in effect, because Germans had invaded the Congo. So those are the only 2 sources of uranium. So General Smuts must have said, what is this stuff and why do you want it? And at the time, he probably wasn't told. But then in mid-1944, he was invited to a lecture with just him and Churchill, and the lecturer was Niels Bohr, the famous Danish nuclear scientist. And they told him what was going on. So then he realized, so South Africa was in the know before the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic blast took place. So it's quite obvious that he realized, and he was also a very, very, very bright fellow. So we've been in the game a long time, and the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation is far bigger than people realize. It's got 2,000 staff. It covers 2,000 hectares in size. I find when I travel around Europe, everybody thinks that it's one floor on one building in the middle of town or something. It's nothing like that. It's a major operation. One of the largest exporters of nuclear medicine in the world, exporting nuclear medicine to over 60 countries, including major suppliers, the United States, for example. Nuclear medicine goes out of South Africa every single day and saves lives. In fact, every 3 minutes, somebody somewhere in the world is being injected with nuclear medicine from Pretoria, and every 3 hours, somebody's life is saved. That's what's going on. So South Africa's had a positive nuclear policy right from way back. Then, as you correctly say, Koeberg was built. Interestingly, the South African government of the day took a decision to start building Koeberg before a Koeberg was even operational in France. It's a French reactor. The French had started building one, but it wasn't yet working, and yet we started building one here. We also made the decision to put what's called a seismic raft underneath it. The entire nuclear reactor stands on rubber blocks. So in the event of any seismic movement, the reactor will be on top of rubber blocks in effect. It's more complicated than just that, but it'll move. It was the first in the world to do that. So the South African engineers did that way back then, yet there's virtually no seismic activity in the Western Cape area in comparison to, of course, Japan, where we saw the more recent Fukushima incident and so on. So South African engineers have been involved in design and development right from the very beginning. Then we went into, as you say, the Pebble Bed Modular Reactor program, which was a small modular reactor. South Africa was the first country in the world to start designing a commercial small modular reactor. South Africa has a huge amount of coal, and the economy has run on coal for decades. The snag is that if you look at South Africa, it's like an upside down triangle, and all the coal sits in the top right-hand corner. So I'm sitting in Pretoria right now. Koeberg is down in Cape Town, and the distance between me and Koeberg is the same distance as Rome to London. So South Africa is big. South Africa is the same size as the whole of Western Europe added together. And people often forget those magnitudes. So what was happening many years ago is coal was being moved from the coal fields all the way to Cape Town. And then, lost in the mists of the past, somebody said, why don't we build a power station where the coal is and rather have long transmission lines, which is what they then did. And we've now produced the highest voltage, longest range, highest altitude power lines in the world, 765,000 volts, which you don't find in Europe. That was South African engineering. But it still means we've got to now take the electricity all that way down to Cape Town. And that strategic consideration is what caused the government way back in the 60s or 70s, whenever the decision was made, to go for nuclear, which, as you said, went operational in 1983-84. One reactor 83, one reactor 84. And so it was built then so that there's electricity coming from the bottom up and not all just from the top corner. But that still leaves us in the situation we've got some hydro stations around the country, but South Africa has got very many minerals. We're hugely rich in many things. One thing we don't have is inland water. And so South Africa is a water poor country inland. And therefore the chances of lots of hydro facilities are not great. We've got a few, but there's no chance of massive expansion on the hydro. And so in the 1970s and 80s and wherever people would have thought about this, and in the early 1990s at Eskom, they sat down and said, now what? And they said, well, let's have a look at how we plan. And looking at how do we power like the gold mines. And the gold mines sit in the middle of the country in the particularly dry areas. And the South African gold mines are big. They go 4 kilometers underground. And so I said, how do we power that? And the answer is we can't practically carry the coal all the way there. And we don't want to have the long power lines. So the conclusion was drawn, you have to have nuclear power. It's the only reasonable thing. It's my contention that nuclear power is the only reasonable thing to drive the entire world in the near future. History teachers in 20, 30 years' time are going to stand up in class and say, we can't believe, wow, way back in like 2020 and years like that, there was any doubt that nuclear would be running the world. What possessed those people to think of crazy ideas and not go full out for nuclear? So now we find it's changing. But then we said, okay, let's put nuclear by the gold mines. And I said, but there's no water. We can't have a water-cooled nuclear. So it came out just from logical thinking that you had to have a gas-cooled nuclear power station. And that's how come the idea for the small modular reactor driven with helium cooling and not water came about. And that's what was the Pebble Bed Modular Reactor program. And the Pebble Bed Modular Reactor started and developed rapidly. It started in Eskom by one fellow saying, why don't we build a reactor? At the time, the chief executive at the time, by the name of Alan Morgan, spoke to me and said, is this fellow on the right track or isn't he? Can I give some advice? So I spoke to the other fellow who was a good friend of mine, Professor David Nichols, and I came to the conclusion that he was on the right track. So I then said to the CEO, I really recommend you back him. So the CEO did and gave Dave Nichols the opportunity to start, which he did. And that thing developed to the biggest nuclear design team in the world. At its height, it had 2,000 people who, when they got out of bed every morning, did nothing but spend the day working on the Pebble Bed reactor. Then we came to 2008. This started, by the way, in 1993 when the reactor officially started, with pencil and paper doing the first calculations. We come to 2008, and it was the big financial crisis in the United States. By 2008, we had a number of the biggest banks were now backing the Pebble Bed program in South Africa. At the time, we didn't need any money. The money was all available. What we needed with the big banks was their psychological backing and their image to show the rest of the world that they would back an export market. That's what they were looking forward to. After the financial crisis hit in 2008, those banks had to show they were consolidating to save themselves. So they all notified they were pulling out. So that was a blow. Then South Africa had the World Cup soccer in 2010. And whenever soccer takes place in a country, the government is always building new stadiums, refurbishing, and so on. So the government was looking for money for the soccer. And also what happened in 2010 is the sitting president, President Mbeki, who was a big supporter of the nuclear program, was unexpectedly pushed out of office by President Zuma, who took over. And President Zuma then put a number of major projects on hold while they had a rethink about what to do next. And the Pebble Bed project was put on hold. It was never cancelled. The green anti-nuclear lobby went around telling everybody it was a failure and it was cancelled, it was dumped. We actually started building the reactor. The pressure vessel was purchased and it arrived in South Africa, and certain sub-assemblies were built and running and being built. It was that close towards actually going ahead and building the reactor. So it's a great tragedy that it went on hold at the time. One of the things I say to my engineering colleagues is that we didn't advertise the existence of it enough to the public. So the public weren't in a position to demand that the reactor not be cancelled or whatever when there was that talk going on. So there was no public support. Everybody said, oh, really? Okay, and on they went. But you needed to get the public of South Africa, and for that matter, a wider area than that, supporting this is necessary, and that wasn't the case. Engineers are bad like that worldwide. They don't tell anybody anything. They go and sit in their tea rooms and they complain to each other that nobody understands them. But when those people say, well, you tell us, I say, no, it's too complicated for you. So we went on hold, and then bit by bit, the people dissipated. In the meantime, Martin, you asked what was the policy. Throughout all of that time, South Africa has been pro-nuclear. Although the government then stopped that project, there was never any anti-nuclear sentiment from government, like you found in Germany and a number of countries that went into this crazy green thing where they think somehow stopping nuclear power is beneficial. It's one of the silliest decisions under the sun to do that. Of course, 2011 brought Fukushima, which gave a big scare. I've been frequently interviewed on Fukushima and asked to write on Fukushima. And I confidently say to people, Fukushima was not a nuclear accident. Fukushima was a conventional industrial accident. How many people died from nuclear radiation in Fukushima? Answer, 0. How many people were injured by nuclear radiation at Fukushima? Answer, 0. How many pieces of private property that were harmed by radiation? 0. In other words, it wasn't a nuclear incident. There was no harm done by the nuclear at all. Yes, the reactors were wrecked. It was a big financial disaster for the owners. It was a big mess, and it was a media feeding frenzy. And when I say it wasn't a nuclear, people say nonsense. So I say, what happens if you got 3 Airbus aircraft parked inside the hangar at the airport, and the hangar catches fire and destroys all 3 aircraft? Do you label that as a major air disaster? Or do you just say that the hangar caught fire and destroyed 3 aircraft? And that scenario is what happened at Fukushima. So in fact, with a slightly tongue-in-cheek here before people jump on me, Fukushima was a wonderful experiment. Huge amounts of power went out of control. There were a whole lot of things wrong on the Japanese side. Yet after all of that went wrong, nobody died or got injured from radiation. What a wonderful proof. They talk about the lessons learned from Fukushima. One of the lessons learned from Fukushima is, well, nuclear is far safer than anybody ever thought. That's what actually came out of Fukushima. So there's no doubt that nuclear is going to be the thing in the world. So what happened now in South Africa with the policy that you asked, our government went along just quietly, not anti, but not being overly supportive either. And it just cruised along. President Zuma, when he came into power, in fact, on occasions he talked to me, and he then realized that nuclear was the answer. So you will never find that Zuma was anti-nuclear. In fact, he was always pro-nuclear along the way, but very little government support came about. The current government now has brought PBMR back in the sense that that is now a class of reactors. We have the PWR, which is the Pebble Bed, the PWR is pressurized water reactor. That's a class of reactors. There's many variants on the PWR. We now have the PBMR class, which is a Pebble Bed Modular Reactor type of class. And there's a few of those types of reactors now around. So the government early this year announced that they were bringing the PBMR project back, which has now happened and is now in the process of going through certain government processes. And we expect some announcements to take place, in fact, next month. So we'll see what happens. I would say Eskom is not in a crisis. That's a media thing. What did happen is that, to my mind, and I'll blatantly say, I largely blame the solar and the wind. And this is, you see what's happened in Germany now. Germany has done huge damage to its own economy. There's numbers of countries now that got infected with this attitude that we have a climate crisis, which we don't. There's no man-made climate crisis, and that is a big hoax, as Donald Trump says, and he's quite right with that. And so what happened is that we had people coming from European countries, particularly the Germans, telling us that we've got to be well-behaved and we've got to close down our coal power stations. One of our coal power stations was closed under that international pressure, and it was a big disaster because the local town was absolutely reliant on the coal. People lost jobs, shops closed down, so it's been a major disaster. So we mustn't do that again. We swung around to the wind and solar, and the wind and solar people love to tell you how cheap it is, but it isn't. The solar people come along and tell you how cheap the solar is, but they tell you the price at lunchtime at their front gate where the sun is there and there's no rain and there's no clouds. And when you say, what about solar at nighttime? I said, that's not our problem. And that is the beginning, to my mind, of what happened with Eskom. They started to rely on an unreliable source of supply. They didn't build new stations. In fact, also there were 2 big stations that were under construction, Kusile and Medupi. There was a lot of mismanagement there. So undoubtedly in Eskom, there was a huge amount of mismanagement that took place because certain policies were changed, and they instead of allowing decentralization, which had been the case in the past, that somebody at a power station could just go and buy spare parts because the foreman wanted it, they started to try and centralize this, and therefore did harm at the power stations. There's numbers of reasons. So there were a few things like that happened, but certainly with the case of those 2, Medupi and Kusile, there was lots of management problems and foreign consultants being brought in, which were not necessary, and people stepping on each other's toes. So they went over time and over budget. They should have been running much earlier. They're running now. And so that contributed to Eskom being short of electricity. They also didn't build the nuclear, which they had said much earlier would be built, so the nuclear was all just sitting waiting. It had been decided to build 2 or 3 new large power stations like Koeberg. We went as far as actually putting the tenders out. The results came in. The decision was going to be made the following week, or announced the following week as who the winner was. And with just a few days to go, it was put on hold. And that was way back in 2010. Had that not been put on hold, we would have built the nuclear station and things probably would have all been okay. Because what that then led to was a shortage of electricity across the country. And then a policy was introduced called load shedding. And load shedding means that, to be fair, in sort of inverted commas, they said everybody in the country will share equally in the discomfort. So there are many municipal districts across the country, of course, and they would then intentionally switch off electricity in each one of these municipal regions on sort of a daily basis, and it depended on the day. And on the day, if everything was running quite well, then you might get by without the load shedding at the time. If there was something that went wrong, or like we had no reserve capacity, so one turbine broke in a coal-fired power station, the country was immediately short, and they'd introduced load shedding. And then right across the country, one after another, they were turning the municipalities off for like 1 hour at a time or 2 hours at a time. And the reputation that was projected around the world was the whole country's lights are going on. And when I was overseas speaking to people, they had visions that the whole thing was collapsing. I said, no, it's intentional. There were schedules that went out on the internet and so on. You could look up that your particular neighborhood would be off from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And then the next day it would be off from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. and so on and so forth. So you could somewhat plan ahead and say, well, we won't use electricity at this time of the day because it'll be off. And it became a national joke. That was now fixed over a year ago. We haven't had any load shedding for about a year now, but we still don't have any reserve capacity or any comfort. So we're still too close. Damage was also done to Eskom in that people started to install home solar power, for example, in a huge manner. So there's lots of home solar power, which is now taking the income away from Eskom. So people are using their home power at lunchtime when the sun shines, but they want Eskom to supply at nighttime when the sun goes down. So in effect, Eskom is acting as free insurance policy for everybody. They've got to keep the power running at maximum, but then they get no income when everybody is using the solar panels. So I wouldn't say it's crisis at all. There was a change of management, a new board, a new chief executive about a year or so ago now. And since then, things have improved a lot. But we still need to build new power stations, and we need to get a number of the processes fixed up. And so that's underway at the moment. But I think everything's on the up now, so it's wrong for the international community to feel there's chaos.
Koeberg nuclear power station has been operating since 1984, and it was extended. I would like to ask you for your, as a physicist and researcher, a comment on how the nuclear power plant has been performing, and what's your opinion about extension? Is it relevant, or you would say, let's build a new one? What's the situation?
Well, Eskom is running very, very well. And in fact, they just celebrated a milestone about 10 days ago that reactor number 2 has run for 365 days continuously at 95% availability, which is its design availability. And so it's been running perfectly for a year now. And what happened is that first one reactor was taken out of service for some months while they went through the major upgrade, which was putting in new steam generators, which is done very rarely in the world. The steam generator is larger than a Boeing 747 and heavier than a Boeing 747. And that had to be taken through the side wall, and the old one had to be cut out and removed, and a new one put in place and welded and joined. So it's a major, major exercise. And then the tests that have to take place afterwards, and each reactor got 3 new generators. So that took 2 years, and that they did the one reactor, then ran it for a while, then started on the other reactor, and so on. That's all complete. They have a license extension now for another 20 years. But in fact, the upgrade has effectively made the reactor good for another 40 years. The new steam generators are better than the ones they took out because there's newer technology, newer design, materials, so on. So the reactor is actually better off than before. And the reactor is recognized as being one of the best run in the world. So I'm very comfortable that the reactor is good for a good service. It's interesting to note, by the way, that the Koeberg electricity now is the cheapest in South Africa by far. And that leads one to say that the anti-nuclears are so often saying nuclear is too expensive. But what they do is they just look at the immediate capital cost of a nuclear power station, the immediate capital cost of solar panels, and tell you solar is cheaper. That's not how you look at it. You have to look at it over 40, 50 years. Because Koeberg now has been running for 40 years, producing the cheapest electricity. This upgrade has been a bit of money, but it's not that much. So what will happen now is that Koeberg will get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, in the sense that if the coal goes up and up and up, Koeberg will be very stable. So you ought to look at nuclear over 40 years or something, not over 4 years. And so it's important to have vision at the level of government, vision at the level of the industrialists and the financiers. Financiers being very difficult. Financiers always want to know what is your return in 3 years, not as what is your return in 30 years. So there's quite a lot of psychology involved in trying to get people to see the future and have the vision. As far as I'm concerned, worldwide, a lot of the world leaders that we had 20, 30, 40 years ago had much more vision than many of the world leaders we have today.
May I ask you, Dr. Kemm, when I was researching the uranium supplies in the world, which is part of my research field, South African uranium belongs to one of the best quality in the world, based on my articles that I read. Who is supplying the fuel for Koeberg? Because on one hand, it is French technology and French design, we can say that. On the other hand, South Africa has tremendous supplies of uranium, or maybe we can say uranium as a mineral, but the second thing is uranium as process fuel for the nuclear power plant. So can you please explain how this works and what you expect in the future regarding fuel?
South Africa has got a lot of uranium. We produce the uranium every day. In the earlier days, as I indicated at the beginning, it was coming out with the gold anyway. So it was being piled up. So when the uranium interest started, we had all the uranium piled up anyway. So in the waste dumps that were at the gold mines, we've got a couple of uranium mines, so uranium specifically, but much of it comes out of the gold. Of course, our next door neighbor, Namibia, is a large uranium supplier. So if you take South Africa and Namibia together, Southern Africa region there is really a major uranium supply. At the moment, we export uranium from South Africa on a daily basis, and that goes into the world markets in a form called yellow cake. That is the form in which it's traded. So when you look up the uranium price, the yellow cake is an oxide U308, but it looks like yellow custard powder is what it goes out as. And so that is done daily. Now, way back, again, a number of years back, when in the apartheid era, as you mentioned at the beginning, South Africa was having sanctions and getting squeezed by countries around the world. And so we found that the Americans at the time were supplying fuel to Koeberg, and Koeberg was potentially could close. So the government made the decision that we had to make our own fuel. The S4E8 reactor in Pretoria, which is the one also that produces the nuclear medicine that you mentioned, that one also, the fuel was stopped by the Americans. Fuel was actually at the airport in the United States to come to Safari, and Jimmy Carter stopped it. And we'd already paid for it, and he stopped the fuel and kept the money, which didn't leave a good taste in the mouth here. And so we were then told urgently to get on with making it, which we started doing, and South Africa succeeded and made the fuel. The major issue there was the enrichment of the uranium, which is a whole big saga, of course, with the whole Iranian affair at the moment. And so we succeeded in enriching the uranium. And as a result, we were able to make fuel for both reactors. Then we made the fuel for Koeberg. We loaded South African-made fuel into Koeberg, and everything was fine. Then we came to 1994 was when there was the big election in South Africa, which elected the black majority government. But to do that, countries like the US said they will not support that election and the transition if we were making our own fuel and if we were making our own space rockets, because we were developing space rockets at the time. We had one ready to go into orbit, and we were effectively ordered to dismantle the rocket and stop the nuclear enrichment and so on. So we were forced to stop the enrichment. So South Africa currently does the entire fuel cycle, everything except the enrichment in the middle. So we have to import the fuel and so on. In the Safari, we make the fuel, but we have to import the uranium. We've been getting fuel from the US and fuel from the French. Of course, there's years of fuel in stockpile. We wouldn't be so silly as to have a shortage. And then a while back, when the contract came up for renewal with the US tried to insert extra clauses into the contract prohibiting us getting back into the fuel market, and we refused. And that's still the subject of negotiation. So as far as I'm aware now, we are not getting any fuel from the US because they're trying to twist our arm, and we won't accept that arm twisting, which I totally support. So I'm all in favor of us getting back into the fuel manufacture for Koeberg and for the Safari reactor as well, and for now the new range of small modular reactors we're in a position to supply. So South Africa can become a world exporter of nuclear fuel. It's not difficult. At the moment, we only need the enriched uranium, which we have no problem in getting, because there's various suppliers, excluding the US, of course, that have got that uranium.
And nuclear waste goes to?
We have one of the largest and oldest waste repositories in the world. It's called Foul Pits. It's in the Northern Cape. It's huge. The waste repository there is the size of 20,000 football fields. That's the area of the repository. It's been running for 40 years now. And so there's very experienced people there. That is at the moment where all the low-level and intermediate level waste goes. The nuclear waste is divided into 3 levels. Low level is if you're in a nuclear environment and you use paper towels or gloves or all sorts of things like that to maybe wipe up some nuclear liquid or something, all of that has to go out via a particular pipeline, so to speak, and it goes into 200-liter drums. And those drums are all transport numbered individually, so everyone is numbered what's in it, and it gets transferred up to foul pits where it's buried. But by buried, it means stored in the sense that every single drum is numbered. They put on a computer what's in there. There's thermometers, hygrometers, and everything put down there with cabling to the surface. And that's been going on for decades. The intermediate level waste is things like pipes or something that have been taking radioactive liquids and they're active. And there you get about concrete drums, which are about 2.5 meters wide with a concrete lid, and all the stuff is put in one of those concrete drums, and they buried underground in the same way. At the moment, the high-level waste, which is the spent fuel, there is no legal decision to put it anywhere. So the high-level waste is stored on the site at Koeberg and on the site where there's other reactors like that. And that is the case worldwide. I'm only aware so far, like Sweden, Norway, Sweden and Finland. Sorry, Finland was first, followed by Sweden. They authorized the underground storage of the high-level waste. France is busy working on such a system now, and one of our colleagues in Pretoria is one of the chief engineers on the design of the French system. So that's coming out of South Africa. So it's a worldwide issue at the moment. So all over the world, people are saying, what do they do with their waste? I mean, you get countries that haven't got the space, like Europe. I had a Zoom meeting a while ago, and people say, how do we find a piece of land as big as a football field? And the Dutch were saying, we can't find a piece of land in the whole of the country as big as a football field. I said, gee whiz, and I said, fellas, we got thousands and thousands of football fields lying. And they were so jealous, it made me realize the exact magnitude of the problem across Europe. There's nowhere. Like here in South Africa, we can go to some small town and just drive 100 kilometers out into nowhere. There's nobody there, in effect. There's no such concept in Europe of just riding 100 kilometers into nowhere. So South Africa potentially is in a position now to be the importer of these spent fuel elements from around the world, which we then keep here in a storage situation that people pay rent to keep their fuel here, so to speak. That would be perfectly feasible. We need international cooperation on nuclear.
When there is a contract or proposal for new nuclear plant being built in the European Union, America, or Russia, they usually look for two things. There is the water to cool down the nuclear power plant, and who is going to build it? Because usually there are four countries: United States, France, South Korea, and Russia. Sometimes China might have some interest. But almost nobody is speaking about South Africa. And I would like to give some room to present the nuclear reactor that you are working on, HTMR-100. You already said that it's cooled down by gas, helium. But what is behind the technology, and in which stage is it now? For instance, is it completed on 95%, 100%, or how is it?
Okay, well, the HTMR-100 came out of the original PBMR when the PBMR closed down. Effectively, I said it was never legally closed, but in effect went into suspension. And a number of the scientists and engineers who went and created a private company, and that one then designed the HTMR-100. There were a couple of significant differences between the PBMR and the HTMR-100. The exit temperature of the gas was reduced from 940 down to 750, which is still very high. The conventional PWR reactors are 250, 300, and the temperature makes a very important factor when you're looking at process heat to feed the heat directly into things like oil refineries. So that we can come to that. And they did one or two other things to make the reactor faster and cheaper to build. That has been under development for over a decade now. We're now in a position where we can start building that reactor effectively now. We're ready to build what's called the S4E8, which is the first of a kind. We're getting a lot of interest from around the world of financiers and also customers. So we're ready to go with that. As I said to you earlier, they actually started building the PBMR. The pressure vessel was made and so on. So we're up to that level. And so it shouldn't be hard for people to believe that we can also now build the HTMR-100. But we have a problem in that a lot of people in like the US and Europe can't imagine that South Africa can build a reactor. I was in New York the other day as a guest speaker there, and some fellow asked me if there's a tarred road between Johannesburg and Pretoria. Well, the road is 5 lanes each way, tarred road, far better than anything you find anywhere near New York City. When I drove on the New York roads, the South African roads were far superior to the New York roads. But with that mentality, they don't believe us. But yes, we're in a position to go ahead now. And we are very interested in international funding. We've got a number of people talking to us at the moment. Some are actually in the country today. We had others from another country here 3 weeks ago, and that's what's been going on as well. So we envisage that it'll be built soon.
When it comes to small modular reactors, I, for instance, study Rosatom's academic Lomonosov, which is basically a ship which is able to come to the coast and power like 100,000 people for like 3-5 years without refueling. So this is a flexibility of academic Lomonosov technology by Rosatom. Your technology comes from Africa. How easy is to move the technology to different countries in Africa? And just for our imagination, how big is this reactor? Like how can we imagine the complete plant?
Okay, well, one nuclear reactor, one small modular reactor, the entire complex will fit on one football field. But the system is designed to take up to 10 reactors on one control room. So you can get 10 reactors on about one football field as well, because you don't have to duplicate the workshops and the this and that and that. Each reactor is a cylinder, 60% of which is buried underground, and only 40% stands above, and it stands about the height of a 4 or 5 story building is what's above ground. So what you see is like a circular, cylindrical 4 or 5 story building standing inside a concrete silo. And so you can design one for one reactor, but with space for 9 more. which means if you add them, it's not difficult. We've had a lot of interest from African countries. There was obviously by far the majority of African countries, virtually 100% of them have got no water. A few have got coastal sites with the seawater, of course. But as soon as you go inland, and African countries are very big in surface area, as I indicated earlier. And so where we got dams, in fact, interestingly, the Russian floating reactor, they came to South Africa and they sat and talked to me, and we talked about the concept of a floating reactor. And at the time I said, well, why can't we put one like on Lake Malawi or something where it floats around on the lake? And then they went and built the current one, which is up in the Arctic regions, and so it uses the very cold water. And we're currently also, by the way, designing a floating nuclear plant. It's very much advanced. It is for a Dutch company, and they want to use it for mining. And I venture to say it'll be a lot more advanced than the Russian one, and we're far down the track with that. But on land now, the HTMR-100 is ideal. It uses helium. That was very intentional as well. The helium works as a coolant, but also if the helium comes out for any reason, the reactors walk away safe. There are some reactors that work with molten lead as the coolant, others with molten salt. And if you want them far out, like in a mining community, if something goes wrong, you don't want to have a whole lot of really skilled scientists and engineers on hand because your molten lead reactor stopped working and the lead is solidifying inside. With our one, we say, if the worst of the worst of the worst were to happen, is walk away safe. You all just go down the road and have a cup of coffee and chat about who's going to inform the newspapers and who'll write the report for the boss. You just leave the reactor alone, and over the period of 5 or 6 days, it'll just cool itself down with no human intervention required at all. And that's been shown to be true. It's been tested out and so on, and we're right. And so that is a major factor, that you just put it there and it will do its thing. Also, once you start running the reactor, in principle, it can run for 40, 50 years without ever switching it off. Now, I'd hasten to say that's not what will happen, because there will be legislation that tells you that every so often you have to stop the reactor for inspections and so on. But the reactor is fueled on the go. It's an OTTO process, OTTO, once through, then out, OTTO. So you drop fuel balls over the top, and they spend 2.5 to 3 years wiggling their way through to the bottom, and then they come out at the bottom. So that's why, from a technical point of view, the reactor, once it's running, never needs to be switched off. But there will be legislation saying every so many months, just like aircraft, every so many hours, the aircraft has to be taken out of service to check the engines and the body and so on. So all of that will be for the regulatory authorities of various countries to decide, but it certainly gives us huge flexibility.
When I studied your technology, I was fascinated how the fuel works, because it's sort of like ceramic coating egg sort of principle, that inside is the fuel and around is the ceramic coating. So 3 questions that I must ask. First, are you able to produce the fuel from A to Z as the whole process? The second question, will this fuel be a waste, or how this works in practice? And the last question, how expensive is to produce that fuel? Because on the paper, it sounds like a fascinating technology, and I was really impressed.
Well, yes, we can produce the fuel here. We have a plant. We've produced the fuel. The final fuel was taken and tested in the United States at Idaho. It was tested in Norway and in Germany for many, many months, and so on. And it passed everything with flying colors. That's all been done, and we've got that. So the fuel plant exists here. It's currently sitting in a care and maintenance state because we're not selling the fuel, although there are potential customers. We've recently done fuel designs for 2 different companies in the United States, because the United States can't make the fuel. We can. So the fuel is there. And as you say, it's quite fascinating, because the fuel for Koeberg is a 3.8 meter long metal assembly with many zirconium pipes with the uranium in those pipes. The HTMR-100 fuel is the size of a tennis ball, and it's black when you look at it. It's graphite, but inside the graphite, the uranium is all the size of grains of sugar. And every one of those grains of sugar is coated in various coatings, and one coating is silicon carbide. And the silicon carbide is a very hard shell. So every grain of uranium has its own safety vessel around it in the shape of the silicon carbide. So the radioactive particles cannot even get through the silicon carbide. And then they are all rolled into this carbon, the graphite matrix. So you hold the ball. You can hold a ball in your hand when it's made. It's perfectly safe before it goes into the nuclear reactor. When it comes out of the nuclear reactor, if you go anywhere near that ball, it will kill you in an instant. And so there's handling processes. We've designed the reactors that every reactor can have up to 40 years worth of storage space underground. That will then be dependent on what the law says in various countries and what one then does with the fuel afterwards. So that's up to the various governments and authorities and whoever to come to the conclusion. But we've looked into all of that and we can accommodate whatever anybody wants to do. I imagine over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, there'll be a lot of readjustment in the world in opinion on what to do with this fuel. And I've already indicated I believe South Africa would be a terrific place for the world to bring some of the fuel, to put it here into storage, like keeping your gold bullion in a bank somewhere under somebody's protection. And we are quoting now the electricity coming out of an HTMR reactor. It's something around 15 to 18 US cents per kilowatt hour. And we plan that will be able to come down to about 10 US cents per kilowatt hour. That, of course, depends where you build it. People ask us, what's the price? And you say, well, if you build it in Vietnam or you build it in Zambia, for example, we've got to find out what does it cost to pour concrete in Vietnam and in Zambia? What are their local labor costs, et cetera, et cetera. So we can do pretty accurate calculations, but not down to the last $1, which is what some of the financiers want to know. And also, if you build more than one, like a site with one and a site with 10, it would be obviously different. So it would be a case of working out for everybody, but we've done huge financial calculations, so we know these numbers highly accurately. And we're getting a lot of interest from African countries, but also elsewhere. We're getting interest from Europe. We've had interest from Australia, Indonesia, Asia. A number of these countries have come to us to say they're very interested in our reactor because it works so well, and there's a whole lot of other factors, of course, they take into account.
In Hungary, there is a construction of the PAX nuclear power plant, which is run by the Russian Rosatom. However, when you have a look, nuclear power plant is never only reactor, it's also the management, the pipes, the system, the cables, the security circles, and all those. So in Hungary, for instance, there is a cooperation between Russian company, which is the main constructor, but also the Americans, Germans, French companies supplying little parts. When we take the technology HTMR-100 and we take it as a plant, not a reactor itself, do you need any international cooperation, or are you able to basically build the whole thing based on South African technology?
We would have international cooperation. We can do a lot more than people imagine. When we get foreign visitors coming here, they're astounded to find out what South Africa can do. And we can do a lot. But we would go for international cooperation. I mean, for example, now with the HTMR-100, one of the redesigns that we did when we moved from the Pebble Bed is to have a steam turbine and not to put the helium gas straight through the turbine. In other words, the main turbine we will just purchase from one of the turbine suppliers in the world now. So we know what the price is. There's no R&D involved, and we wouldn't go and want to develop the entire turbine fabrication here. We would just buy it. One thing I must say about the nuclear fraternity is worldwide nuclear people collaborate. You saw when Fukushima happened, all over the world, nuclear people were prepared to dash there to help them out. The nuclear is like a worldwide brotherhood, and we would encourage that. A very large reactor system has just over the last year or two gone online in the UAE called Baraka. It's 4 big reactors, and there are 160 South Africans there working on it, including senior positions, the heads of all the reactors, the chief engineer, and many other people, all South Africans. There's also a further about 150 subcontractors that are South African on that plant. So there was major South African input. We're actually proud of the fact we've got South African engineers, nuclear engineers all over the world. I'm constantly surprised where we find more South Africans popping up. So we're very much into the nuclear of the world. We collaborate all over. I've been to the US and spoken to nuclear people in UK, Russia. I was guest speaker in Vietnam some time ago concerning their nuclear ambitions. And so we like to feel that we want to keep in a friendly basis with everybody in the nuclear game. We try to keep the domestic politics and whatever international politics away from it, and us nuclear guys try to work with each other, which I feel is the way that the world needs to go with an energy supply.
You mentioned people, and that's my next question, because you, as a physicist and the chairman of the company, sort of brain behind, this is one person, but you need people who are operating it, people who can maintain the nuclear plant, people who can basically come with innovation of design, or people who can basically say this is safe because of this and that. So what is the education quality in South Africa regarding nuclear science or nuclear technology? And how do you see this process? Because we are getting older and we need the next generation to be as good as we are, because we must transfer the knowledge. And I think this is quite important because everybody is getting older, no matter which country, which nationality. And in academia, it's the same system. You have a professor, and many times you ask, so who is going to take over? And sometimes you see, like, I have no idea because I don't have young people. How is this in South Africa, especially from your point of view?
Well, I think the situation is quite good, but it could be a lot better. I think South Africa is very well placed in comparison to the rest of the world. In fact, we have here an organization called SANYPS, SAYNPS, the South African Youth Nuclear Professional Society, which are all young people, and there's many of them. I indicated earlier, South African government, and that has never been anti-nuclear. So other than the extreme greenies that are always around, we've never had a sentiment in the country closing nuclear down. So there's always been this positive nuclear feel amongst young people and people of intermediate ages and so on. So we've got that. Right now, we're trying to encourage it. There's been comment coming out, we need to do more. In fact, with me and another grouping of people, we're busy launching further education into nuclear. I was invited to go to Zambia a couple of weeks ago, where I went to do a presentation. The Zambian president came to the function and gave a very positive speech at the beginning to open the function, where he really saw nuclear as something for the future and was all behind encouraging people to study it and so on. So we've had that. We've been to Namibia. We've had also from the president of Namibia personally, there was a very positive pro-nuclear, and a number of other African countries such as Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and more, all indicated right from presidential level support for nuclear and therefore for the nuclear training. Now, most of nuclear, the people are not dealing with nuclear themselves. You know, a nuclear power station has got standard electrical engineers, mechanical and electrical craftsmen and so on, who need to be aware that there's nuclear there, but they themselves don't have to have lots of nuclear training. So you need nuclear scientists and nuclear engineers, then many good craftsmen who've had some nuclear training so they know what's going on. Just like if you work in a chemical plant as an electrical engineer, you don't have to know the chemical engineering, but you should know what happens if a chemical comes out. So you need some background training on what you're doing. I like to make an analogy of an aircraft. You get an Airbus flying with a number of staff on board, but the pilot and the co-pilot understand aerodynamics and how the aeroplane works, but the stewards and stewardesses and everybody have to be aware that in the aeroplane that they are doing a different job. So yes, we're going for that. We want to produce a lot more skilled people. We've had people in the last year or two come here from France and from Russia, and they were amazed to discover how good the South African welders are to do really high-grade welding. Both of them said that we could take your welders back to our country because we're desperately short of welders of that caliber in our country. So we've certainly got people of the right caliber. We need to train up a lot more, and we need to do it across, and my feeling is sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot of need for it, and there's enthusiasm. So I see it as positive.
Nuclear energy comes automatically or logically with some geopolitical implications. And I read, for instance, there was a recent publication in South Africa about nuclear energy by, I think it was the Johannesburg University Press, and it's open access publication. Very, very nice. And they also argue with the dependency on someone when you basically buying nuclear power into your country. So let's touch this geopolitical aspect. I know that several countries, including Russia, South Korea, United States, France, and China, have expressed interest in supplying South Africa with a nuclear capacity or energy. So can you, based on your experience, because you travel across the world, can you explain how do you see this dependency? And what is the difference between, let's say, Russia or South Korea? What sort of partnerships they offer?
Okay, yes, good question. Let me just make an analogy again. You've mentioned Koeberg nuclear reactor a few times. If Koeberg were a coal-fired power station, it would need 6 trainloads of coal a day to run the power station. But as a nuclear power station, it needs 1 truckload of nuclear fuel per year. So what you find with nuclear is you use very, 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 very little fuel. And in fact, with the Pebble Bed fuel, for the HTMR-100, those balls, the size of a tennis ball, 6 of those balls will supply all the electricity for a family of 4 for 10 years. So that's the amount of energy there is in nuclear, and why I'm so convinced the world will run virtually entirely on nuclear in the future. So one great advantage is that you can quite easily stockpile a lot. So what you found recently in Europe with the Russia-Ukraine affair and so on, Germany suddenly discovered how dependent they were on Russian gas and so on and so forth. So there's been a scare across Europe. Now, of course, there's the Middle East with the fuel in the Middle East. So undoubtedly one of the major ones is the fuel supply. So with nuclear, you can put years worth of fuel supply. It's a political economic decision as to how much fuel supply you want to keep in bunkers, so to speak. So that's the one thing. Obviously, everybody will look at not being dependent on, say, one source. So we're aware of that. We want to be fuel producers of the pebble fuel, but we've also said to people we're happy to build fuel plants in other countries in some manner so that somebody doesn't feel that they're 100% dependent on us for fuel. But yes, when we build reactors, we want to also look at spare parts and maintenance or whatever we might find in the future and try and work such that we aren't in a geopolitical position where somebody can squeeze us. And everybody will look at something like that. And we've had that attitude for 40 years plus now. So we're very aware of it. And so far, everything's gone okay. But it is a factor that people very much bear in mind, whether you're too dependent on the east or the west or the middle or the whatever the case might be. So it is a consideration in choosing your technology.
How would you critically assess that argument that let's do renewables, let's build solar, let's build wind instead of nuclear? What would be your perspective? And also South Africa, is there any specific policy promoting renewable energies or basically saying, look, this has a priority now, not nuclear? Or how is it in practice?
Okay, well, to start at the end there, South Africa has been pushing wind and solar a lot over the last number of years. And I think that has been wrong. We've been doing it far too much. We're far too much involved with the wind and the solar. A lot of that has been because the European Union and others come here and twist our arm and say, you've got to be seen by the international community to be well behaved. You've got to cut your carbon dioxide emissions. The Chinese are not cutting their carbon dioxide emissions. They're building more daily than the rest of the world pretty much is getting rid of. I feel that the whole climate change thing is wrong. There is no human-induced climate problem due to carbon dioxide coming out of coal or out of the industrial processes. If you look at it in some depth, you'll find that it's just plain and simply false. It's a big political thing on the part of the extreme Greens to try and gain political power. If you read their websites, that you'll find they want to get control of humanity in very many places. You find the strange situation that the very, very left-wing people who say how liberal they are the ones that are least tolerant of people not doing what they want. And the right-wing people are the ones that most say, I don't care what you do, just go and obey the law and make money and leave me alone. So you find that the people that are trying to police everybody else are the supposed left-wing. Now you see there's been one of the world's best, and I say this with amusement, experiments taken place. The Germans went into wind and solar in a huge way. The Germans are so hung up with trying to get rid of the CO2 and everything, they closed their nuclear power stations, which is ridiculous. So the Germans now go into this in a big way. Immediately next door, they have France, which is the world leader in the percentage of nuclear in their country. France is 70% nuclear. And there is France going along merrily. What do you find? The French electricity price is way under the German electricity price, and the French production of carbon dioxide is way under the German production. So the Germans have done all this to supposedly come up with cheap wind and solar, to supposedly reduce the CO2 output, and they're far worse off than France, who's their neighbor. It's not even as if it's a country on the other side of the world, as you can see, all the conditions are different. They touch each other. So to my mind, that's absolute proof that the French are right and the Germans are wrong. And I think that that's busy unfolding. The German chancellor just a while back said, I think it was a mistake to close the nuclear. Von der Leyen has also just the other day said, look, the nuclear policy was a mistake. We shouldn't have done it. So the EU is starting to realize they were wrong. But for the last decade, they've been coming here and very aggressively telling us to do as they say. And that's been wrong. And we need here to have more sense and to say, let's stop it. I feel that South Africa is always quoted as one of the best solar places in the world, which is true. We have phenomenal sunshine. Our midwinter here looks like midsummer in Europe. You can put and sit on the beach and tan on midwinter's day here. And so we need to put solar where solar is directly applicable for a specific purpose, like running the grinding of the maize on farms for the feed for the animals or something that you can do over lunchtime. But there's a push for the people on the one end of the spectrum now to try and run the country on solar. That's wrong. Similarly with wind, they're just far too intermittent. If you look at graphs, you'll see of countries that have got solar, wind, nuclear, and so on. You'll find the nuclear goes along like a dead steady. Now, what do you see with solar? You see like this with the solar. What do you see with wind? You see this with wind. So to try and solve that problem, they say, well, why don't we do batteries? So we take all the top end of the solar and wind and push it into batteries to try and fill the gaps at the bottom, to try and bring it to look like nuclear. And that then means you add more solar, more complexity. And then that's, well, why don't we try and put storage into dams and this? So all you do is complexity on complexity on complexity. That's not going to work far out in the mining communities of large African countries. You want a nuclear thing like the HTMR-100, you switch it off and you go and have coffee and you read a book and everything's okay for the day. So that, to my mind, is very important. And there's a lot of politics in there trying to argue that wind and solar is cheaper. And then they say, look, over the next half a dozen years. So don't look over half a dozen years. Look at 20 years. Make a decision now that's right, 20, 30, 40 years. Then you find that the economics in that comes out very much more in the favor of nuclear.
The last question for today's interview, Dr. Kemm. How is the support from African countries for South African development of the nuclear technology? I mean the HTMR-100, but also institutionally, we have the African Union. There are also regional institutions and organizations. So taking Africa from the Pan-Africanism point of view, how do you feel as a researcher, as a company chairman, when it comes to that sort of regional or African cooperation?
Very, very good. I'm an African. I happen to be white, but my family landed here in 1700 and something. I'm here. And I go to Europe. When I'm in Europe, I feel distinctly not European, where sometimes people think just because I'm white, I've got more affinity to people in Rome or London or Paris or something. But no, I come back here and my black colleagues here are much more buddies of South Africa than those people are over there. And there's this feeling around Africa, although there's different African countries, many languages, we feel that we got to look after each other because nobody else is coming. You find a lot of these people come from Europe and they tell you how much they've come to help you. They've never come to help you. They've come to give you money on a loan basis that you have to repay with interest on condition that you do as they tell you. It's always in their interest, so they keep telling you that it's in our interest. So rule one, nobody comes here to give you money in your interest. They come here to give you money in their interest. So now we've got to look at all these things of linking reactors together. Now, with the internet as it is today, it is quite possible to have, say, 20 reactor stations in many countries in Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, all interlinked with the internet. We've done quite a bit of work on this. I've got a number of research projects at universities going now on this. that you can have monitoring stations in certain places. Where in a monitoring station, we have a major one already in South Africa for telecommunications, for example, with the world's largest television screen in there, believe it or not, 110 meters wide, and one screen. And so you can see you can see all of the nuclear operations over many countries on a screen like this. You have more than one for diplomatic reasons. You can see the pressures, the flow rates, maintenance procedures, where spare parts are. All that sort of thing can be in one big database that can move around. So you don't need every African country to have its entire nuclear regulatory thing up to a massive standard. You don't need everybody to hold spare parts, everybody to do everything. You have a big collective arrangement like this, something how like a cell phone works. Cell phone system has cells all over the place that collaborate, rather than the old telephone exchange. We had central exchanges doing that. So that's what we envisage. And we're finding, as I've indicated a few times, how many African countries are approaching us and talking and saying, look, this is what we want. We have organizations like AFCON, which is the African Confederation on Nuclear Energy. AFCON has been in operation for many years. They've been talking about small modular reactors. They've also been talking about the good sense of stabilizing on one particular model and one particular company. They've been talking very much to us. It would be logical for AFCON to adopt our reactor as the standard reactor so that it fits into the scheme I've just mentioned. We've also spoken to the African Union. I, the other day, spoke to the commissioner of the African Union for energy, lady, and she was very pro-nuclear. We had some discussions. We're going to have more discussions soon, because the AU is also now very much in favor of looking towards this. They appreciate the independence that is necessary for the African Union region, but also for each African country. So we don't find, as you already indicated, that we find that we're too dependent on some outside power block. And I think that's terribly important, because world electricity consumption is going to double soon. The past 25 years, the world electricity consumption doubled. Some of the greeny extremists keep saying, no, we must stabilize electricity and cut everything down. Nonsense. It's going to go at least the same curve, if not more. And Africa will go faster, because we've got the youngest population in the world. And that lot is going up in living standard, but also it's expanding. So it'll be faster here. So we've got to look to double the electricity output of African countries within something like a dozen to 15 years. I don't think we have the luxury of 20 years. And that's got to be done with dotting small modular reactors all over the place in a collaborative way, so that we are in control and are not at the end of the tail of somebody else's donkey.
Dr. Kemm, many thanks for sharing your research and practical insights with us. I think it's a fascinating story, and for those who are researching energy in Africa or African energy diplomacy or geopolitics, I would like to also advise to divide energy into upstream, midstream, and downstream, because the visibility of the sort of dependence or who is controlling what is very nicely when you divide the sector. So, because usually people take Africa as one continent or one entity, but it's not a monolith. So I think it's good when each country is divided into upstream, midstream, downstream from the technical point of view. And this lens gives a great geopolitical and also internal politics picture of how the energy is doing. Again, Dr. Kemm, many thanks for being on the IR Thinker.
Well, thank you very much for the interview. I appreciate it. And I must compliment you on the research you've done. You asked exceedingly sensible questions. You've been excellent. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and your approach.